In 1900, thousands of people living in the city of Manchester were suddenly stricken with a very mysterious illness. It started with nausea and vomiting, but then this escalated to paralysis and even death.
Ooh, a medical mystery, eh? I love me one of those.
Me too. At first, doctors thought these poor souls were suffering from alcoholic neuritis, known as alcoholic neuropathy today. And this is an illness caused by chronic excessive consumption of alcohol. It was a reasonable diagnosis to make. You see, alcoholic neuritis was really common in Manchester, especially among beer drinkers. Now, Manchester was known as the hardest drinking town in the realm, and a writer of the time even went so far as to say that the shortest way out of Manchester is notoriously a bottle of Gordon's gin. One of the city's unenviable claims to fame was that for many years it had the highest rate of this illness, more than twice that of London and 5 to 10 times that of Belfast, Cambridge and even Dundee. So high was the rate in Manchester that doctors here were classed as the nation's experts in the condition. But during the second half of 1900, the number of cases reached an extraordinary level, even for alcohol-fueled Manchester. Something very strange was going on. Suddenly, hospitals were swamped with cases. Alcoholic neuritis was accounting for nearly a quarter of acute admissions and around half of all outpatients. Initially, it was just explained away by everybody drinking more. There'd been a national election, and the British were currently doing very well in the Boer War. Both fabulous excuses for a tipple. And many of the patients that were flooding the hospitals were of the working class, which fit the usual demographic for alcoholic neuritis perfectly. You see, the working class were known as the drinking class.
The best class, if you ask me.
But when the nurses and doctors asked them just how much they had been drinking, they all insisted that they were models of restraint, only drinking moderately. The doctors didn't believe them though. They were all clearly just blind drunkards. As the months went by, the number of patients continued to grow and grow. Still, to the doctor's surprise, most of them claimed that they were drinking moderately, just a few pints of beer a day. Surely this couldn't be the case though. They weren't even drinking strong spirits, just beer. It certainly wasn't enough to be producing such severe symptoms. Eventually, some of the middle class got sick too, and they were drinking even less, a mere 1 pint of beer a day. Now, the doctors considered the middle class to be a reliable bunch that, unlike the working class, could be believed. So, the doctors began to wonder if maybe something else was going on, something more sinister. You see, along with the claims of moderate drinking, there were two strange things that really stood out. One, the illness only seemed to affect those that drank beer. Spirit drinkers seemed perfectly safe. And two, patients were displaying symptoms that didn't quite fit with an alcoholic neuritis diagnosis. Now, the hallmark signs of alcoholic neuritis were pins and needles, burning sensation, and muscle tenderness and weakness, and dropped hands and feet. But in addition to these, the patients had all sorts of skin complaints. Their faces were puffy and mottled and blotchy. Their skin often looked like it had been stained with red ink, and over time, the red darkened to a bronze, and then would darken even further, sometimes nearly to black. And once again, classism would come into play. Initially, the doctors thought that the patients were just very dirty. I mean, it was to be expected. They were of the lower classes and they of course had no idea of personal cleanliness. So, it was time for a scrub. The nurses tried washing the patients again and again, but to no avail. The dirt, it wouldn't come off. To start with, the pigmented skin would have a wonderfully soft and velvety feel, but sadly this wouldn't last. It would eventually become scaly and peel off, leaving lovely deposits on the bedsheet. The skin on the hands and the feet would thicken and become studded with blisters that would burst and nodules that would break off. The nodules on the feet were very attractively described as looking like pegs of horn driven through the thickened sole. The skin on the hands would become so thick that it became difficult to close the hand. Eventually, one clever doctor called Reynolds noticed something very important. There was a huge increase in the number of herpes zoster cases, shingles, an infection that causes a painful and blistery rash. And this was when the penny dropped. This was the key to the puzzle. At the time, arsenic was the only known drug which produced shingles. It all made sense now. The patients, they weren't suffering from alcoholic neuritis. Oh no, they were suffering from arsenical neuritis. There was arsenic in the beer. Ernest was sure of it. Ernest would put his theory to the test, and he began analysing beer from local breweries. What he found was really quite shocking. Most of the beers did indeed contain arsenic. The cheapest beers, the fourpenny ales, were the worst offenders, so no wonder it was mostly the working class that was getting sick. Ernest would announce his findings to the Manchester Medical Society in November, and soon the press caught wind of the poison in the beer. The Manchester Guardian published an article announcing the peculiar epidemic. The papers of course began to put the public into a terrified frenzy, with daily articles about the dangers that lie wait for them in the pint pot. The incident would come to be known as the Manchester Beer Epidemic. After the announcement, it became practically child's play to recognise arsenical beer poisoning. It had such a unique grouping of symptoms. First, there was the nausea and vomiting. Luckily, some people realised that the beer was making them sick and stopped drinking the stuff. Next, the eyes would begin to stream and the nose would run, and the afflicted were constantly mopping their faces. Along with the skin conditions mentioned earlier, the poor patients suffered from terrible neurological symptoms. First, there was a tingling in the fingers and the toes. This then progressed to burning and pricking sensations, especially in the feet. It was agony. Some described it as walking on hot bricks, or like dogs gnawing at the soles of their feet. In some pubs, beer even came to be known as tenderfoot ale. Then the hands and the feet would start to go numb, and people could often be seen rubbing their fingers together to try and get the feeling to come back. Then came the sensitivity. The arms and the legs would become so sensitive that a light squeeze caused intense pain, and even the weight of their bedclothes became too much for them to bear. Walking became so painful and difficult, and apparently you could hear a sufferer a mile off due to the sound they made when walking. The double rap step, doctors began to call it, the heel coming down first, followed very quickly by the front of the foot. In healthy people, the second part would be much more gradual. Some could no longer sit up in bed, and some became completely paralysed. Sadly, it wasn't just the body that was affected. Many also suffered memory loss and ended up in a peculiar waking, dreamlike state. Thousands and thousands of people would be afflicted with arsenical beer poisoning. Even as little as a pint of beer a day could produce devastating symptoms, some of which could last for nearly a year. Interestingly, the birth rate declined dramatically, likely because everyone was just far too ill to get it on. It would seem that no one was safe. Poisonings were cropping up in the most unlikely of patients. A 2-year-old little girl was brought in to see a doctor called John Brown.
No, you're not serious. I don't like where this is going.
Oh, I'm very serious. She was described as a bonny-looking little girl, and unfortunately she'd been suffering from pains in her hands and her feet. So bad was the pain that she refused to wear her shoes. The palms of her hands and the soles of her feet were red, and she had dark brown splotches on her thighs. John checked her knee-jerk reflex and nothing. The symptoms, they fit in perfectly with the announcement he'd heard about arsenical beer poisoning, but how could this be the case? She was just 2 years old, for goodness sake. Well, on speaking to the girl's father, John soon found out that he operated a public house. The little girl would toddle around the pub, and the kindly disposed customers at the bar would entertain her by giving her little sups of beer. John organised for the beer at the father's pub to be tested, and lo and behold, the beer contained arsenic. Now, if you thought that this little girl was the youngest victim, well, you'd be wrong. Sadly, many babies were poisoned by their mother's milk because their mothers had been drinking tainted beer. On November the 26th, the first 2 deaths were announced, and it soon became clear that this epidemic, it wasn't confined to just Manchester. Reports of arsenical beer poisoning came flooding in from Lancaster, Liverpool, Lichfield, Preston, Chester, the list goes on. It had taken months to discover the true cause of the mysterious illness, and it's thought that over the course of the epidemic, 6,000 people have been poisoned, and it's likely that even this is a conservative estimate.
I'm just going to come out and say it. If the doctors had listened to those working class patients, they probably could have solved this mystery a lot sooner.
Yep, I think so too. As the number of cases began to rise, so too did the death toll, until 70 lives had been claimed, and most of them were women. You see, men would drink in public houses, and they would spice things up a bit by visiting different pubs. Luckily, the beers from different brewers were poisoned to varying degrees, with some not being poisoned at all, so drinking a variety of them meant that their intake of arsenic was diluted. The pub, though, was no place for women, the delicate little flowers that we are. So, while some women braved the rowdy pubs, many drank their beer at home. Apparently, women would congregate in each other's houses and send for cheap beer during the whole of the day. They would usually buy their beer from one local tavern, and that was the problem. If their choice of tavern sold contaminated beer, well, they'd be ingesting a hell of a lot of arsenic with no uncontaminated beer to dilute it. So, how was the arsenic getting into the beer? Well, it would turn out that brewers were substituting malted barley with glucose sugar, and this was to keep the costs down. This glucose sugar was coming from a single supplier called Bostock & Co, and business was clearly booming for them because they were supplying over 200 breweries across the Midlands and the North. Now, Bostock made their glucose by boiling starch in sulfuric acid, which they had sourced from a company called Nicholson. And here lies the problem. Nicholson made the sulfuric acid using arsenic-containing iron pyrite. Why? Because this was the most cost-effective method. It always seems to come back to cost-cutting with these things. Now, how much arsenic was in the beer depended on what percentage of the malt was replaced with glucose. So, the cheaper the beer, the deadlier it was. The pure beer movement had an absolute field day with this information. For years, they had been campaigning for legislation to keep beer pure. That is, made with barley malt, hops, yeast and water. Sadly for the movement, arsenic was also detected in barley malt used by brewers. It was introduced by the drying process. Coke was often used as the heat source for the drying, especially in the north of England where Manchester is located. And what a surprise, Coke often contains arsenic. It was now becoming increasingly clear that beer, the drink that was such an important part of British culture, had probably been poisoning people for years. Doctors had the horrifying realisation that many patients that they diagnosed over the years with alcoholic neuritis had actually been suffering from arsenical neuritis, gotten from drinking tainted beer. Understandably, the public became very fearful of drinking beer, and so they switched to tea and to whiskey.
Ooh, whiskey's my absolute favourite.
I'm definitely more of a rum kind of girl. Luckily though, they wouldn't have to abstain from the golden brew for long. The Manchester Brewers Central Association quickly came to the rescue, appointing a committee made up of Manchester's finest doctors and experts in the brewing industry. The committee developed a two-step plan to rid Manchester of arsenic-tainted beer. First, they issued a recall of all beer made with Bostock's glucose sugar. The beer was to be tested, and if arsenic was present, the beer was to be destroyed. Now, this must have been quite the sight, because thousands and thousands of barrels of beer ended up being dumped into Manchester's sewers. The second step was, of course, for brewers to stop using Bostock as a supplier, and for new batches of beer to be tested by a professional analyst to make sure that it was arsenic-free. Salford, Liverpool and the other affected cities copied Manchester's clever plan, and in total, hundreds of thousands of gallons of beer found itself flowing into the sewers. After all of this, of course, an inquiry was held to find out who everyone should point the finger at. At the inquiry, there was shocking revelation after shocking revelation. The first was that Nicholson sold two grades of sulfuric acid, one that contained arsenic and one that didn't. They touted their arsenic-free one as the purest acid sold on the face of the earth. They had supplied Bostock with the pure form of the acid for many, many years, but by March 1900, demand for the arsenic-free acid had just skyrocketed and they couldn't keep up. So, the savvy brothers at Nicholson came up with a plan. They reviewed all their contracts to see if anyone was receiving pure sulfuric acid that hadn't specifically requested it. They would then replace this with the arsenic-containing kind. As it would turn out, Bostock, they hadn't requested arsenic-free sulfuric acid, and in their contract they had said absolutely nothing about what they intended to use the acid for. Nicholson, of course, refused to take the blame for this poison beer epidemic. They would argue that it was Bostock's fault for not telling them that the acid would be used in food products. If they had known this, they would never have dreamt of sending them the unpurified acid. It would have been murder to have sent it. They pointed out that the new acid was a completely different colour. It had a brown tinge to it. Surely Bostock should have noticed this. Bostock, of course, felt that Nicholson were to blame because they'd always supplied them with pure acid and they changed the purity without notifying them. The next shocking revelation was that Bostock had also used the arsenic-containing sugar to manufacture their own line of fruit-flavoured table syrups. They sent samples of these syrupy death concoctions to retailers, and each tin unwittingly contained 2 grains of arsenic. Thank goodness though, Bostock had made a mistake in the manufacturing process, and the syrups had solidified by the time they reached the retailers. The shops couldn't sell solid syrup and so returned the tins to Bostock.
Wow, that was a close one. I think Bostock should get out of the food business. Maybe pest control would be more up their alley.
Yeah, they definitely need to stay away from all food products. In the end, the jury decided that Bostock and Nicholson were careless, but not criminally so. Both companies got a bit of a telling off, but that was it really. Bostock did face some repercussions though. They were successfully sued by a number of brewers, and of course brewers stopped using them as a supplier, so the company eventually went under. Despite the absolute devastation that the Manchester beer epidemic caused, the public's fear of beer was very short-lived, and it wasn't long before everyone was back to drinking their favourite tipple. In the end, some good did come out of this disaster. It raised awareness of the various ways that arsenic could sneakily make its way into beer, and brewers would develop methods to minimise this happening. In 1901, a royal commission was appointed to inquire into the arsenical poisoning from the consumption of beer. A few years later, the commission would recommend setting a tolerance on the amount of arsenic allowed in food products. This recommendation was quickly adopted and enforceable under the Sale of Food and Drugs Act, making food and drink much safer going forward. If you got something from this video, Gargi and I would really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Stay safe, stop drinking any beer that makes you tingle. It could be laced with arsenic. And I hope you have a magnificent day.